I'm Tara Peckham. I have 4 kids and 1 awesome husband. I've been a CECPTA mom for 5 years, and I'm here to make some bread with you. I started making bread when I got married about 14 years ago, and I've made all sorts of breads with varying success over the years. The recipe that we're going to make today is for sandwich bread. I think since we moved to Texas about 6 years ago, I'd say I've homemade our sandwich bread about 50% of the time. About 2.5 years ago, I decided I should change that, and now I make our sandwich bread about 99% of the time. So the recipe that we're making today, I can say I've easily made about 200 times. I know this recipe, it's very foolproof, it's very easy to use, and that's the reason I wanted to share it with you guys. While you guys are gathering your ingredients, I'm going to tell you the 2 reasons I think that people don't make bread themselves. The first is intimidation. Sometimes that comes because you've tried something and failed. I have been there, I know that feeling, and it can be really intimidating to try something again. But thank you, that's you, for being here, because hopefully we'll get over that fear together. The second part of intimidation can be just because people hear baking. And when people hear baking, they think, oh, it's precise, it's gotta be perfect measurements, and it's chemistry, and there's so many things that could go wrong. And bread is not like that. Bread is throw things in a bowl and it works. You don't have to be exact. I will talk more about that in a minute. I promise. 200 times, I know you don't have to be exact. And the only thing that really affects bread are environmental factors. So basically the temperature and the humidity of your house will affect your bread. And all it does is affect how long it takes to rise. That's pretty much it. So it's super easy to adjust for some of those things. And we'll talk about the easiness of bread dough as we go along. I think the other thing that stops people from making bread is the time commitment. Having made a whole bunch of different kinds of bread, generally you get out the bread recipe, you look through it, and you see it's going to take you at least 2 hours of your time. 2 is probably an easy bread. Most of the recipes I find in cookbooks take 2 rises, which means they're an enriched dough, and we can talk more about different bread when we're kneading. But it's usually like, if you want to make bread, you have to know when you wake up in the morning that you want to make bread to have it ready for dinner that night. This recipe that we're making today is not like that either. This takes 1 hour from, oh, I think I might want to make bread, to let me eat that bread. 1 hour, that's it. So it's very fast, it's very foolproof, it's very easy. So hopefully you gathered some of your ingredients, and let's get started. Okay, we're gonna start with our flour. We need 5 1/4 cups of flour. I am using a scale. You do not need to use a scale. I only started using a scale about January of this year. And obviously, well into the 200 times I've made this recipe successfully. The only reason I switched is because there's an Instagram account I follow called Orson Gigi. They're a restaurant supply and kitchen supply store that's in Salt Lake City. And if you like Alton Brown, if you like American Test Kitchen, will love their Instagram account, because they do a whole bunch of comparisons and scientific stuff in the kitchen, and it's great. But if you decide to follow them, just apologize to whoever does the budget in your house, because I'm like their ideal customer. I spent like $200 there when we went. But I use all their stuff, in my defense. Anyway, they did a study about the different ways of measuring flour. So you probably know there's several different methods of measuring flour. There's like scoop into your measuring cup and then level off and dump. There is scoop it in higher than it, level off, dump. You can fluff it with the fork first, scoop it, level off, dump, or you can do what I used to do, which is the scoop and shake. Scoop it, shake it off till it looks approximately right, and dump it in. So they took these 4 methods, they weighed them on a scale when they were done, and the difference was drastic. There was 50% more flour in my lazy version, the scoop and shake, than there was in some of the other better versions. So if you're doing real baking, like with cakes and things that makes a difference, it's good to use a scale. But if you do use a scale, and again, you don't need to when making bread. I did the scoop and shake method for years and these were fine. The difference that I found is my dough is less dry now. And I'll tell you why that's good in a minute. If you look online to find equivalencies for 1 cup of flour to how many grams it would be on a scale, there's also a bit of variety in that. The one that I use is 120 grams for a cup, which is the lowest that I've seen anywhere. I like that because then as I'm kneading my dough and I have to add flour at different stages, I'm not worrying that I'm adding too much flour. If you see a recipe online that has it in grams, just follow what they say, obviously. But 120, it's easy for me to remember, and it's easy for me to calculate all of the other things, 1/4 cup, 1/2 cup, that type of stuff, so I like it. So that's our flour. I've got our, it's not precise, but we'll be adding more in a little bit. So one thing that is nice about a wet dough versus a dry dough is if your dough is too wet, you just add more flour to it. If your dough gets too dry, then you have to add water, and it's kind of like making frosting where a tiny bit of water will go too far and then you have to basically start over and add more and more flour. So it's much easier to add flour than it is to add water to a dough. So it's nice to have a dry dough. So this is my salt. I added in my sugar. This is my salt. I use non-iodized salt because I watched a documentary called Fat, Salt, Acid, and Heat. I highly recommend it on Netflix. And she talks about the flavor of different salts, and I like that. Okay, so got most of these in. The last of the dry ingredients is our yeast. Now, this is where you will go from what I used to have, which is about a 50% fail rate with yeast, to now where I have like a 1% fail rate with yeast. The difference is the type of yeast and the way that you store it. So there are 2 kinds of yeast. There is active dry yeast and there is instant yeast. Most of the time in the store, the little packets you will buy is instant yeast. Instant yeast, despite its name, is actually the more finicky of the 2 types of yeast. It has a higher temperature of water required to activate it and a shorter difference of temperature of what it will accept. Let me just tell you what I mean. I think for instant yeast, you need your temperature of water or whatever liquid you're using to be between 110 and 115 degrees, which is not a big span of space. Active dry yeast is closer to like 105 to 120. So it's a wider range, has a much bigger chance of you getting it right. You actually have a big advantage as a parent because basically you just look for baby bath water temperature and then your water is pretty much right. So what I do instead of waiting for the hot water heater to make it all the way to my kitchen is I fill up my measuring cup, 2 cups of water, which is what we need for this recipe, and then stick it in my microwave for 30 seconds, and that's all you need. I have my yeast in my water only because the yeast I just picked up is like twice as big as the yeast that I normally get, and I don't like the big granules, so I just dissolve it first. But that is totally not necessary in this recipe. You can scoop it and dump it right in. It can touch the sugar, it can touch the salt, doesn't really matter. The important thing to remember about yeast is how you store it. So this is the yeast that I bought. I buy my yeast, you can get some on Amazon. I really like the Red Star brand. This one I haven't tried this brand until recently, but I bought it at a place called the Chef Store, which is off of Midway and Alpha Road in Addison. And I buy my flour there too because I can get a 50-pound bag of flour for $10. and you can get this giant 2 pounds of yeast for like $5. So you can get a year's supply of bread making for less than 20 bucks, which is amazing. Which is another reason why I love bread, because if you mess up and you have to throw it away, you're wasting like 5 cents. Whereas with a cake, you're like, oh, that butter. Ooh. So don't worry if you mess up bread, just try again, it's fine. So you have to remember that yeast is alive. It's an actual live creature, I guess. And so if it is at temperature, if it isn't room temperature or it gets up to 110 or close to that, it will start becoming active or it will die if it gets too hot. The problem with buying yeast in the grocery store is you have no idea how long it's been on that shelf. It could have been there days, could have been there weeks, could have been there months, but it's not refrigerated, it's not frozen, and so a lot of times the packet of yeast you'll get from the grocery store will already be half dead. So if you've had a bad time with yeast from the grocery store, try getting some of this. So this yeast was freeze-dried, and I store mine in the freezer. And then I take a little bit out and I put it in this little container, and I keep this in my fridge for when I'm making bread so that it's not going from frozen into the warm water. That won't do anything. Sometimes it just takes a little bit longer for it to activate. So if you go from frozen into your dough, you might have to add 10 minutes or so to your rising time, but it shouldn't affect the ability of the yeast to do its job. So that's probably my biggest tip when it comes to making bread is buy freeze-dried yeast, buy a big chunk of it, store it in your freezer, and you will have active dry yeast. You will have much higher success rates with all of your bread. That changed my life, learning about that. So now we're just gonna stir things up. These are just the dry ingredients, and you can have your yeast in here. Mine is in my water already. All right, so I just like to make a hole in the middle. You don't have to, you can just dump it all on top. I just think it's easier to incorporate all the flour and get it wet if I start with the hole in the middle, so that's what I'm doing. Now I'm gonna dump my warm water with my yeast in it, right in the middle. Happy little yeast. I've been joined by a little one. By the way, little kids love helping with this process, especially, the rule at our house is usually I scoop, you dump, so that we get the right measurements. But stirring, scooping, dumping, all of these things kids love to do. So now we need 2 tablespoons of oil. You use whatever cheap oil you got. Vegetable oil, this is canola oil, and there we go. The great thing about this recipe is it doesn't take a lot of equipment. It's not going to make all of your dishes dirty. It doesn't take 2 bowls. It doesn't take all the measuring equipment. I can do this with my 1/4 of a cup if I really want to scoop and dump. And this is my 1/2 teaspoon, and that's all I need to make this recipe. Okay, so here comes the make the dough part. If you are less lazy with your flour dumping than I am, then this will probably come together pretty quickly. Back when I was a scoop and shaker, it would usually take me a while to get all of the flour wet. And that's really what we want. I'm making bread, buddy. We want all of our flour to be wet. And most of the time what would happen is I would end up using basically 5 cups instead of 5 1/4, because that last cup, 1/4 cup just wouldn't get incorporated. And again, that was fine. My dough, my bread turned out, everything was fine. So don't worry about it. The only thing that's gonna be difficult with this is that it's very sticky. So it's gonna get all over my hands. It's gonna get all over my counter, my board. I am using, this is a pastry board. Again, totally not necessary tool. I made these with a bunch of friends of mine, and somebody donated the fabric. So this cost me all of $2, and normally they're very expensive. You do not need this equipment. It just helps me to keep things clean. So I made it a generous amount of flour to spread out, only because again, I know I'm low on the 5 1/4 cups. So I know I can put a lot out. And as we are kneading it, we need to knead this for 5 minutes. As we knead this, I probably will continuously be adding flour to my hands or the top of the dough. And depending on how sticky your dough is, you don't have to do that. If it is like sticking to you, then add flour. If it's not sticking to you but it feels a little wet, that's perfect. So see, this is very sticky on my hands. So I just like to get my hands kind of covered in flour as we start. I'm gonna dump out the dough here. And I'm going to look at the clock and figure out how much 5 minutes is. When it comes to kneading, you really do want to stick with the time on a recipe, because sometimes, depending on, again, the environmental issues of your house or how determined you are to get exactly the right amount of flour, your dough can look really different every time you do it. And sometimes your dough will come together really fast and you'll feel like you're done, but you really do need to stick to the 5 minutes to develop enough gluten. So as I have switched to a scale, the difference that I've seen is just in, obviously in this stage, in the stickiness level, and this isn't too bad actually today, but in the finished bread, it just tends to be a little bit lighter, have a little bit more air in it. My previous method, my loaves tended to be a little bit dense, and if they're dense, sometimes they need a little bit more time to rise as well. So I know this recipe takes an hour, but sometimes you have to, it might take an hour and 10 minutes, it depends. It can depend on your oven as well when you're actually baking it, what that is. So I've taken a couple of bread classes that I watch a lot of shows, and I don't know everything about bread, but most of what I know of the technical end, I learned from watching The Great British Baker. So if you don't watch The Great British Baking Show, start watching it. It's amazing. I love it. Okay, so some of the questions that I usually get asked when I've done this class before is, can you use this dough to make other things like rolls or cinnamon rolls or something like that? So the friend who gave this recipe to me has used it for dinner rolls before. I find probably dinner rolls are my least successful bread. I don't know why. I will work on figuring that out, but yes, you can. When we're done with this stage, when we're done with the kneading, we leave it in our bread pans to rise. But you could break it into balls and then put it in either like a cookie sheet or a 9x13 pan to rise for about the same amount of time and then bake them that way, and that would be fine. I've also had people ask me if you can make this as wheat bread. That's a great question. Anytime you have a bread recipe you want to add wheat, you can only substitute half of the flour for wheat flour. I am currently working on experiments to see if that holds true if you do it by weight. Because I know one of the issues with wheat flour is that it weighs more than white flour does. And so if you just use your measuring cup to measure it, you're going to end up, the yeast to flour ratio is going to be off enough that you might have to adjust how much yeast you are using. So usually with wheat flour recipes, you have to use more yeast because it's heavier. It's got to rise it more. So half is usually a good rule of thumb to go with if you want to make this with half wheat flour. I have also taken this recipe, done half wheat, and then added in some seeds. So we've done like chia seeds, flax seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, and I've made kind of a seeded bread loaf. My kids love it. Didn't think they would, but they do. Yeah, so this is probably the easiest bread recipe that I know about. The second easiest bread to do is artisan bread, and that is because it doesn't require kneading. You make the dough, you stick it in the fridge, and then you take it out when you need it, but it does require you to, I think the baking is a little bit more complicated. You have to bake it on a stone or in a Dutch oven, and it needs to be, if you do it on a stone, you have to do it with water in there. So you throw ice, or you make a bain-marie and put some water in a pan and put it in there, bake it with there, and that makes the crust on the artisan loaf. Or you cook it with the lid on in your Dutch oven, and that creates the water circulating, gets that in there. So it's artisan bread is great, awesome, easy, fun, delicious. but there's a couple more complications with it. Okay, so I know I talked about kneading equipment for artisan bread. The only thing about this recipe that might be challenging is that it makes 2 loaves at a time. If you do not have 2 bread pans, I highly recommend Fat Daddy-O's bread pans. You can get them on Amazon. Not only are they really good, but they're really cheap. They're like some of the cheapest stuff out there, and they're really, really good. This one I got from my grandma, so obviously don't expect you to have that. And then this silicone one, I got at Aldi. And so obviously that was cheap. I've had another silicone one in the years past, but it tended to like spread as it rose and as it baked. This one doesn't do that, so I can recommend this one from Aldi as well. So I'm not gonna spray this one because it's silicone, but I do spray this one. Although I will tell you, I don't really wash my bread pans unless something got on them, like from one time I forgot to spray, so then I had to wash it because I got some residue stuff. But if I make banana bread or zucchini bread or something like that in there and it gets sticky, then I'll wash it afterwards. But otherwise, I don't wash my bread pans. All right, this is called I call it a bread knife, but what it actually is a, okay, I will find out, I will put on here what this is called. But this, again, none of these tools are necessary. And some of them, I'm like the pastry board, don't bother getting it, it's pretty expensive. But this was probably the best $4 I ever spent at a restaurant supply store. I've used it for more than 10 years. It's fabulous. I use it to cut all sorts of things. I use it to cut my cinnamon rolls. I use it to cut my dough. I think it's a dough scraper. And it's amazing to clean up, especially if you don't have one of these and you have a flour mess. You just scrape around it and it cleans up. I actually use it when I defrost my freezer to get some of the ice off. It's a fabulous tool, and it was $4, and I think they're still about that. So if you want to invest in something, this is a great thing to invest in. So we're going to just cut our dough in half, and now we're going to form the dough. So it's kind of sticking to my, if you can see that, but it's kind of sticking to my mat, so I'm just going to use this to scrape it up as we go. I don't have a lot of flour in the middle. Probably it's time to wash this. That's the great thing about this is I'll just take this off and wash it when it gets dirty. Okay, so the way to shape a loaf. We're gonna get it kind of in a circle. We're gonna go out, fold in, flip it, same thing, out, fold in, and we're gonna kind of roll it over onto that seam. Karate chop, and tuck it under. Karate chop, tuck it under. You're gonna have this, I don't know why, mine's gonna look a little weird. Yours will look beautiful. I'm gonna just put this right here in my cozy little bread pan. Okay, so let's do the same thing with this one. Go out, fold, out and fold, roll it over, karate chop, and down, karate chop, down, and then we're gonna put this right in here. So now I'm gonna cover these with a tea towel. This one's my Halloween tea towel. And I will just do, I mean, if you can fit them both under one, feel free. I think that's what I didn't need this one. Now I'm gonna leave these to rise on my stove as I preheat the oven. That kind of guarantees that you have a warm enough environment, because the top of your stove will get nice and cozy, and then it'll take 25 minutes for these to rise to the point where we're ready to bake them. My oven takes about 20 minutes to preheat, so it works out really nicely. So set a timer, pull out a book, do the dishes, whatever, 20 minutes. Okay, we're ready to peek and see how our bread is doing. Look at that, it's perfect. It's risen a little bit above the edge. I put my silicone bread pan on this little quarter sheet baking tray because sometimes when I move it, I tend to knock it and it deflates a little bit. So I found putting it in here keeps that from happening. But okay, our oven is set for 350 and we're ready to stick these in there. It's going to be 20 to 30 minutes to bake. Mine usually take on the 30 mark, but I think the recipe says 25. Timer's going off. We should have yummy bread ready to come out of the oven.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Don't touch. Okay. So right when it comes out of the oven, we need to take it out of the pans, put it on a rack. Otherwise, you get all the moisture down at the bottom as it dries and you end up with a soggy crust. So you can let that cool as long as you can stand it. And if you put them in bread bags, when they're still a little bit warm, it keeps the crust nice and soft. You can stick them in the fridge. I've had people ask if you can freeze it, and the answer is I think you should be fine, but I never have because we've never not eaten it all. Most of the time we eat one bread the day we make it, so I will not judge you if that happens. And then the second one will last us a little bit. My kids are quite frankly not as enthusiastic about this bread. It becomes normal after a while. So it's still great to have 2 loaves because I can give it away. I can make it every other week, but there's lots of things. You can never have too much homemade bread, right? It smells amazing in here. I hope it smells amazing at your house.